Let me share my screen, folks, and we'll get started with our presentation for today, which again is moderated research best practices. I'm Ben from DScout, and People Nerds, so very thrilled that you're with us. Moreover, we're going to be showing some of the best practices and tactics in use in a DScout project. If you haven't used DScout before, this will be a great opportunity for you to get into the platform and poke around. We have a sandbox project that we're going to be adding anyone who's interested to. So if there's something that you want to get your hands dirty with or practice with that any of our panelists show you today, don't you worry. We will be getting you access. Okay, so I don't need to introduce myself. You all have the privilege maybe of having me invade your inbox each week. But I am very excited to introduce three of my colleagues and friends. I get a chance to, at least pre-COVID, got a chance to share air with these folks. Over here, their smarts and brilliance. These are people who have leveraged, utilized this project, both for their own research and for customers and clients. They are folks building these sorts of tools, and so they know what goes into and why they are making them in the particular way. And maybe most importantly, these are folks who are expert in translating ideas that might have been, or methods and approaches that might have been done in person in the field, face-to-face, to remote methods. So if you're someone out there who has a question, you're not sure if it would fit into a remote methodology, these people are the pros. And I'm hoping that you will leave today with some best practices and next steps on how to transform your design. So Tim, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Ben. So Tim Reardon here. I'm a research advisor at DScout, which means that I help subscriber clients, as Ben was saying, translate their research objectives into projects that are sort of optimized for the DScout platform, which includes helping researchers set up and plan their remote interviews with Live, which is DScout's moderated interview tool. A little bit of background: prior to DScout, I did my fair share of in-person moderated interviews, and in addition to practicing more remote qualitative methods. So, I've done drive-alongs with small business owners who work out of cargo vans, spent the day tagging along with people working in the gig economy, talked with investors, doctors, artists. So I've had a variety of experiences moderating both sort of in person and remotely, and I'm glad to be with all of you to sort of share some thoughts on making the most of going remote.
Thank you, Tim. And speaking of DScout Live, Tessa Lathrop is our product manager for that tool. Tess, welcome.
Hello, thank you for the introduction, Ben. Yes, I'm Tessa Lathrop. I'm the product manager of Live, all things Live related. But now I am putting my researcher hat on. So I'm a researcher turned product manager. Had a background doing ethnography, in consulting, doing field work, going out into the boonies, using and mailing personal webcams to do diary studies. More low tech, then worked at a startup and did more usability testing, discovery research around technology, and now I am here.
We're so excited you are, Tessa. I have the privilege of sitting back to back with Tessa, so Tessa and I are, I would say, best friends. So keep yourself muted, Tessa, because we are best friends. And finally, Casey, who works on DScout's in-house innovation research team, The Studio. Casey, welcome.
Thanks for having us. So yeah, I'm Casey Oberlin, and I am a researcher on The Studio. So we are a professional services, kind of full service research team where we translate our clients and partner with them to really go from initial ideas all the way through to analysis and deliverables. But this is a very big shift for me. I come from a social science background. I was a sociologist. I am a sociologist, but I was a faculty member at Grinnell College for a number of years. And so I've done a lot of different research, teaching methods as well in the classroom. So one of the recent projects that I just finished is, I will shamelessly promote,
yes,
which is tied to an ethnography I did at the Creation Museum. So I have predominantly done in-field, in-depth remote work, or excuse me, in-depth work in person in organizational settings prior to joining DScout.
Thank you, Casey, Tim, and Tessa. So again, folks, whether you're coming from a product background or you're a social scientist who has made the transition, or you're someone who's been in client services or frontline research, we have experts here who know or are familiar with that background. So let's get into it. We're going to talk a bit about some of the benefits of this method broadly. We're going to go through some considerations that you should have before starting. And then we're going to go through some best practices, looking at 3 different parts of the method of doing the work: the pre-session, when you are in a session with someone, and then post-session. And where relevant, we're going to jump into the DScout platform and show you how this looks and how you can start making use of some of these tactics. So let's talk high level about the benefits of going remote. Casey, could you lead us off, because you have been talking about your work in field. What are some of the benefits that you see, especially compared to the work that you were doing when you were a faculty member at Grinnell?
Yeah, if I had the tools that we have now, then it's just a complete game changer. But kind of a couple of examples that come to mind for me are like the easier to reach a broader pool of participants. So this broader access is key. I think as a social scientist, your funds and time are really limited. So you always went wherever you could reach the most number of people because you were assuming it had to be in person. So I did field work at a free healthcare clinic, and they wanted to know why people weren't using the clinic. So I had to, though, interview who was there. That's the critical mass. So I think about now, if I could actually shift that and be able to reach out to remotely their friends, neighbors, things that people they'd recommend, that'd be a much more nuanced and kind of rich insight into the non-utilization problem that's really thorny to solve. So that's kind of a couple of pieces there that were really important to me. The resource saving isn't really particularly large when you think about now who you can reach and how quickly and effectively.
Yeah, I know, Tess, you and I have talked about in your development of and thinking about Live's roadmap, just thinking about all the different tools and things, the stuff that a researcher or a designer or a product person looking to conduct research has to have on hand to make a session go seamless or to scale up. Can you talk a bit about some of the benefits that you see from your perspective?
Yeah, definitely. I think, to add with what Casey was saying, that broader access to participants is so key, especially when there are places that you can't easily get to. When I was at Uptake and we had, it was more B2B, and I needed to interview a nuclear engineer, some plant that I couldn't get to, or a trucking maintenance manager in an area where there's a lot of dangerous equipment. Going remote is so much more seamless, although it does require a lot of different tooling. But I think that there's a lot of resource savings that not only makes it so it's a little easier to streamline the tools that you need, but also, we've all been there when you're advocating for field work with your stakeholders and they're like, how much is this going to cost? You're going to be flying where for how many weeks? It seems like you just want to go on a vacation, which is, a little bit true, but I think with, you need to get to the voice of the user. You need to complete these interviews. And so sometimes going remote provides you such resource savings that gives you the green light to be able to do this research.
And Tim, Tess, I had a conversation with a customer colleague last year who works at train yards. And this person was saying, it's a small group. There are only so many train locomotive conductors and engineers. And moreover, they're a rather guarded population. And so, Tim, I'm hoping you can talk a bit about the experience that you've had talking about different topics or getting more deeply with folks through remote specifically, or the differences that you see when you've done some in-person sessions and then when you've done similar sessions remotely, and some of the differences that you see.
Yeah, so I just want to reiterate that the main sort of benefit that I'm hearing from clients that I'm working with is definitely the fact that they can get to people who are geographically dispersed much faster and at much less cost. They can be, talking to someone in New York in the morning, talking to someone in San Francisco in the afternoon, talking to someone in London in the evening. So definitely have increased access, no need to sort of change gates or fly through different airports. Definitely less airport food, less time spent in car rental parking lots, things like that. And resource savings, both in terms of, cost, monetary, but also in terms of just energy. I think being out in field and flying back and forth to different locations can kind of be taxing, and being able to do it all from the comfort of your home, I think is a huge benefit.
Yeah, we've got some questions from folks about contextual inquiry. I think the method is a particularly good one. As we'll show, DScout Live has the ability to use mobile phones, smartphones for interviewing. So I know Tim, we've worked with customers who are in the CPG or retail or grocery space, and they want to see safely how a customer navigates an aisle or decides to enter a store. I mean, do they use particular entrances, or how are they thinking about their bodily physical space vis-a-vis other people? And so, Mindy, your question about contextual inquiry, Tess, myself, and Kate, well, we all might have just been next to a person certainly pre-COVID, and but before remote methods became as accessible as they are. But now you can really be with that person without having to be with that person. So it's not just, for my money, the resource saving, pun intended, but it's also that candor. But both they feel more comfortable because they're talking to you here, and you get access to places you might not otherwise. Tim, you were talking about some holiday projects that you're doing. Could you say a bit more about those?
Yeah, definitely. So it's probably pretty unlikely that a participant or a scout would, invite you into Thanksgiving dinner to sort of see the setup process of, what they're making, what that setup process is like, or with the holidays around the corner, any sort of holiday party, anything like that. And with a remote method, it makes it much easier to sort of get into those moments that, as you're saying, you probably wouldn't get invited to otherwise. So if you're interested in seeing the sort of setup process for cooking a Thanksgiving dinner, you can have someone set up their computer in the kitchen or set up their mobile phone on a tripod, sort of get a window into that world that you probably wouldn't have been able to see.
And many of you may be familiar with DScout for our longitudinal moments-based method, which we call diary. You can certainly use that, wherein you're asking folks to document moments of highs and lows during say, a Thanksgiving meal. What are you missing and wishing for during a particular meal? The benefit of going moderated is you get that longer session, and you really get to capture all of those nuance. So let's actually move to some of the reasons why you might consider something like DScout or DScout Live specifically, and that is as a spec-built, purposeful tool for doing the work we're doing. So Tessa, I'm going to throw it over to you, because this is something that you spend a lot of your time thinking about, both as someone who has conducted experience research, field ethnographic research, contextual inquiry, and now developing, designing, and speccing a tool to do that. What are some of the reasons that you think folks should consider a purpose-built tool?
Absolutely. I'm going to try my best to minimize the shameless plugs that I'll do. This is not a sales call, but I can't hide how relieved and excited I am to have access and also influence over a purpose-built moderated interviewing tool. I think when I was a researcher at Uptake doing a lot of remote moderated interviews, I had to use a lot of what we put in here, kludgy solutions. I think there's a lot of benefit to having Google Hangouts and having Zoom and having Skype Enterprise. But I think it also makes it so you're jumping in between a lot of different types of products. That product, like Skype or Zoom or Google Hangouts, only does so much. It's a web conferencing tool. So there are a lot of things that are missing that I think a researcher needs access to when we talk about our tool set. And I think what happens then when, like, I'm trying to fill in the gaps by having a Google Docs open, by having multiple observers in the call, but you have to tell them, don't say anything, don't show your camera, and you have to awkwardly tell the person who you're interviewing, like, don't mind these people that are in the session, that you don't really have a great smooth workflow. Having to use Calendarly, going into my email, making sure everything's updated, messaging everyone, having to figure out which email that I need to do, sending out all the different links because, oh no, this user can't use Zoom, they can only use Hangouts or something, I think makes the workflow a little harder. It makes the overhead a little bit more, a couple of different pots that you have boiling all at the same time. I would also say that having a purpose-built tool, especially live, helps remove some of that tech-related burdens. I don't know if anybody else has dealt with this, but getting your participants up and going into a tool can have a lot of problems. I mean, my parents, thankfully in COVID, have now figured out how to use Zoom, but it's a battle. It's a battle to say, hey, your fingers over the webcam, or you set me down and now I'm looking up at the ceiling, you're muted, you need to turn off your whatever. And I think a purpose-built tool like Live affords some of that onboarding and some of that training out of the box. So I don't have to set up a 30 minutes with each participant beforehand to train them how to use these tools, which I think is really limiting because you think about that when you're not using a purpose-built tool in how you're recruiting. You're like, will this population sample have a lot of trouble using these types of tools? Oh goodness, I need to now build in a buffer for that. And the last point that you have here around encouraging collaboration, I think it hits it on the head. And I think especially for a purpose-built tool, that collaboration is built in end to end. It's built in the session, it's built in post session, where you don't have you and your analyst or another team member having to figure out, okay, who's going to record this? Who's grabbing the recording? Who's putting it in the QuickTime? Are you going to chop it up? Do you want me to chop it up? Here's a list of points that we want chopped up. Do you want me to use my notes to figure out tagging? We got to put this in a transcript thing and pay a couple of dollars so it's actually accurate. I think there's a lot to say with making collaboration a little bit more seamless and keeping everybody in their own lane doing what they need to be doing and working together a little bit easier.
And Tessa, thank you. That's very, very helpful. And to that point about collaboration, I've heard from so many folks in the People Nerds community that COVID and remote research more broadly has that's why I put there an empathy for the research process. For a lot of you, your stakeholders, and maybe even some of your collaborators, it's like a black box. They say, I want to know X, and you're that person whose job it is to go figure out or, try to uncover what X is or what might be affecting X. Purpose-built tools, as you'll see, allow for more easier observational roles. You can add them as a viewer. You can encourage them to play with and get closer to the research process, which certainly might not, make them, well, it should make them better as a consumer of research, but I think it will make them more empathic in the work that it takes for you to think about an interview guide and for you to think about your sample and why you've recruited in the ways that you have. Casey or Tim, any other thoughts on when you have used a research specific tool versus maybe a tool that you've MacGyvered into something for research?
Yeah, for sure. So I can jump in. I think the thing that sticks out for me the most is that when I'm using a purpose-built tool, it really feels like I'm able to sort of be more present with the person that I'm interviewing. I think that's because, like, if I can just set the stage for a second with, if you're sort of using a mishmash of different kludged together tools, you probably have your video conference software, you probably have a separate program for your discussion guide over here, a separate program for your notes, a separate program for a chat, the observers, and the participants sort of like somewhere in the middle, hopefully. And anytime I've used a handful of different tools that aren't sort of designed to work together, I really feel like it sort of takes my attention away, and my attention sort of like dispersed in more places other than the participant. So it's sort of easier to get distracted, sort of easier to come across as distracted or disorganized to the person that you're talking with. I think that has costs in terms of the sort of like interest from the participants and the level of engagement that you get from them. So I would say that's using a purpose-built tool, I think, helps me sort of do a better job of listening to someone, sort of connecting with them in the moment.
Yeah, and that resonates so much for me, Tim, in terms of being able to be present, especially remotely, right? This is something where you want to be able to center and kind of see what's going on, have some input, but not get distracted with, is everything at the right level? Can I see it all at one point when I need it? And I think there is something around from the in session, also moving to analysis happens so much faster because I'm not literally getting everything in the right format, where it's all like pulling together or harassing a collaborator to make sure they share their notes, or all of those kinds of tools. Being all integrated has been really a time saver.
And I have heard from so many folks, both you three and others in DScout and in the People Nerds community, that regardless of the research question they may have, the overarching goal is to collect or to empathize with the person who's using our experience or who's a fan of our brand. COVID has done a whole host of things for experienced thinkers. It has put the human maybe more front and center in the human centeredness of everything. So Tim, to your point, if a purpose-built tool helps you increase rapport, increase engagement, increase immediacy, even though there's a screen or a set of channels between you two, that will make the research better. So many of our customers at DScout are saying, we really want to empathize with what folks are doing and going through so that we can meet them where and how we can. That's great. So I'm curious if we can turn to the chat for a second, folks, as we go to the next slide. I'm curious what your workarounds have been. I was talking with our panel yesterday and they were interested to know some of the time-saving things that you've done. For those of you who have yet to use a purpose-built tool, what are some of the workarounds that you have, and specifically around multitasking? Do you find it harder to keep engaged in a session when you do have, to Casey's point, observers pinging you and you're trying to make sure that the transcript is going out or whatever it might be? I'll be curious to read as we go through this what some of your workarounds have been if you haven't yet used a purpose-built tool. And if you have used a purpose-built tool, why do you like it? We would certainly like to see that. So let's now move to, if you have an idea and you've yet to consider it in a remote moderated context or for a remote method, let's talk through some of the things that you might want to consider before you take that. And so I'm going to turn it over to Tim, because both Tim, Casey, and Tessa are all expert in translating the designs. They do so regularly. Tim is usually on the front line talking to customers who are new to the method or who haven't thought about it in the remote method approach. So Tim, can you talk through some of these critical considerations that you have, things that folks really ought to start with?
Yeah, for sure. So, you're no longer in person, so you no longer need to think about things like airfare or car rental or anything like that. But there are definitely some unique considerations that we have outlined here. So, one of the first ones is expectation setting with collaborators. You really want to make sure that everyone sort of knows what their roles and responsibilities are. You've obviously got the moderator, but a really important one to nail down is who's taking notes and how exactly are they taking notes and where should they be taking them? What level of detail should they be including in the notes? With a lot of remote tools now, we have things like auto transcription. And so it's not as necessary for a note taker to sort of furiously take down everything that they're hearing and seeing. They can sort of do a better job of sort of highlighting the most descriptive parts or the sort of themes that are sort of bubbling up from the surface. So that's important. Another important one is to sort of make sure that collaborators are set up with access to the platform you'll be using ahead of time and that they're comfortable using the platform. You definitely want to avoid receiving those urgent messages 5 minutes before the session saying, I need tech troubleshooting help right now. That's definitely never fun. And then in terms of communicating with the scouts ahead of time, you definitely want to sort of set clear expectations with them about what the session is going to involve. Is it just going to be a Q&A where they're just sort of chatting with you back and forth, or will they be expected to screen share from a computer? And if they are expected to screen share from a computer, does that computer need to have access to a particular application in order to screen share? Does that live on their personal computer or maybe on their work computer? Definitely really want to be very specific about what sort of technology they need in order to complete the session successfully. And then another thing I like to remind clients about in terms of environments, the sort of digital environment that the session is taking place in. So if a client is going to be screen sharing, definitely want to make sure that there is nothing open on the computer that they wouldn't want the scout to see. But then also if the scout is going to be screen sharing, it can be really helpful to encourage the scouts not to sort of like do any digital tidying up. Because if the person wants to see the sort of usage context or the sort of technological ecosystem in which their product is living, can be very helpful to sort of see what the natural desktop looks like. So don't close out of any other apps, don't close any web browsers, don't tidy up. Just like you sort of in an in-person setting, encourage someone not to sort of tidy up their kitchen or don't tidy up on our behalf. And then another really important one is just operationally. A big one that pops up to mind for me is additional consent that might be needed. If you're doing research with scouts who are under the age of 18 years old, you're probably going to need something like parental consent. You want to have a really easy way to sort of send them a link to a consent form so they can very easily sign it and make sure that that part of the process is taken care of before the session starts. So those are some things that sort of pop to mind to me when we think about critical considerations for remote.
That's great. And Tim, I love that you had the call out of the tidying up. I know that Casey and Tessa, you, in addition to Tim, have done in-homes where you get there and you can smell the cleaner and you're like, I told you it's okay. That this is another, going back to those broad benefits. When I say you really are getting a more authentic person, you're often, I mean, you're in their room as they've got it. And if you've had some pre-session communication, hopefully you are getting that more authentic, both physical environment, but digital environment. Casey, Tessa, are there other things that you really want folks to consider before they get started with this approach?
I was gonna add, in addition to not wanting them to clean up, sometimes, you know, if you are dealing with sensitive PII data, or you have a healthcare client, or you're dealing with financial data where you're like, don't show me on your screen your credit card or social security number, setting those expectations up front can also help in case you don't want to spend hours redacting everything. But also, I know somebody asked a question about, you know, the inability to scan someone's workplace and get that visual context. I'd say a lot of that has to do with setting expectations up front. So, you know, communicating and saying, hey, we're gonna be doing a, you know, if it was our tool, a live mobile session. And I'm gonna ask you at some point in time to flip the camera and to give me a view of your desk space. You don't need to clean up. And we may, you know, I might ask you about a couple of things on the desk or in your workspace, or we may do a tour of your home or whatever it is. I think setting those expectations up front can still get you in the context, looking at the environment, especially if you're using mobile. We had a customer who was doing interviews in the garage and had to switch over to using live mobile so they could use broadband where there wasn't Wi-Fi. And that's a perfect example of getting into the context, getting into the environment, and adapting using technology.
And I think to that end, that's also, like, I think both Tim and Tessa bring up kind of illustrations of what it means to be inclusive and accessible, like throughout the entire process. So well before the call starts. So I think that's another kind of aspect that we consider quite a bit, is that it's making it like building some rapport. They can communicate what they need, what's going on in their lives at that moment. You can have a plan for that in advance rather than just kind of having it be thrown on you in the moment. That often happened to me in person, right? So I think there's a bit more control, a bit more of establishing a long-term connection when you're setting it up remote.
Yeah, and I think all of this really speaks to the amount of, not over planning, but just the word is in the title, the consideration. You know, if you're a comfortable, affable, other-oriented field researcher, you can adapt, and you're reading the participant. If you're doing an in-store with them or an in-home, you know, you are certainly trying to make the most of the session. There seems to be a little more on-the-fly flexibility. When you're asking someone to give of their time digitally, you certainly want to plan, as these folks have said, for if you're going to show them a concept or prototype. Do you want to have control over that? If so, make sure that they have the correct share link, or that you've talked to the design team so you know which version you need to get. There are things that, as these folks have said, need to be considered in advance here. So good call in, Tessa, to that question from Chris. Chris, we'll be talking a bit more about some of the other ways that you can use moderated remote research to do, again, more than just an interview, which might be a space exploration, or not outer space, but physical space exploration, and unboxing, a setup. Those sorts of things are really great use cases that these folks here have had a lot of success using. So let me just check to see if there are any other questions. All right, let's move on here. Keep those questions coming, folks. So let's actually move now to some of the ideal use cases. And these images that you see on the screen are designed versions of the live tool. So if you are a DScout customer, you have access to the tool wherein you can share concepts. You can do so over desktop or mobile. But I'm hoping that the three of you can talk about some of the use cases and the applications that you've really seen success using DScout Live and remote moderated more generally for.
Sure. So I can jump in here. So in addition to, simple conversational interviews, which is like a Q&A back and forth, one of the things I've really been encouraged by in terms of seeing success are these like in-home product testing and setup types of projects, where essentially what we're doing is having a scout sort of show you the process of like maybe setting up a new speaker system that they would use at home, showing you and sort of telling you the steps involved in the setup process, or thinking out loud about how it's going and telling you about where the blockers are and where the pain points are in the process. To do this, you can sort of use either desktop, or you can use live mobile as well. So you could ask scouts to sort of move their computer to the room in which the product is being used. In the case of the speaker, they might set up their computer in their bedroom or maybe in the living room. sort of no matter where they are. One of the things that's really important with these types of projects is you want to sort of, at the beginning of the session, want to guide the scout to set up the camera angle, so you can sort of get both them and the product that they're using, the sort of context in which they're using it, all in the same frame, because you've only got that one angle to work with.
And I think it's important, Tess, if you can talk about how the ability not only to go with remote mobile or desktop, but the application of screen sharing opens up some of the ways that you can capture things. To Tim's point, we worked with a customer earlier this year on setting up a smart speaker that also had a mobile app component. And so it wasn't just about showing the room and where the speaker was and some of the motivations behind that setup, but then the researcher asked the participant, that's what we call our scouts, scouts as participant, to share their mobile screen and walk through the app experience of the digital setup. So Tess, I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about what that screen share or some of the ways that that opens up the sort of multi-channel experience studies.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we had somebody who was testing a modem setup process where they were conducting the call through the mobile device, so they could see the scout, they could do a little intro. Then they were flipping the camera, showing the actual physical installation of something, then turning on their screen share to show the app as they were installing it. And then when the app was installed and everything was all set up and they were walking them through that experience on app, then flipping back to the front of the camera, turning off screen share and then talking them through. I mean, that, when I haven't seen the data, but when I think about that session and all the different touch points and all the different surfaces you're able to analyze, it's just incredible. I think with, depending on what tool you're using, whether you're sharing prototype images, you're going through a Figma workflow, you're actually sharing a app that you have had your developers put behind in staging, and you can have the user click through things. I think there's a lot of potential. I mean, even if we think about contextual inquiry digitally and you just want to watch the person, talk me through how you shop, or I'm just going to stay quiet and you're just going to walk through, which is, different than the typical, here's a task, complete it. And you're just exploring with the person on their desktop. I think it adds a lot more variety than what you might think might happen. You will be able to see a lot of the different, I guess, landscapes of where that participant or scout is kind of going through in the internet. So I think that's really exciting about having digital, is you can see a place where I think most of us spend way too much time staring at screens, but it is a huge part of people's lives.
And Tess and her team have gone through great lengths to try to capture the data that you as experienced designers and thinkers and researchers might not need immediately, but that your stakeholders might later. So any project on DScout is automatically transcribed. When a scout is screen sharing, that view is shared as well as their face. So I was saying to Tess today, I have a background in communication studies. And so I'm always very interested in the emotional expression, or rather the facial expression of emotions. And I'm sure those of you who have run usability studies are trying to figure out like what delights and what dismays people. I'm a naturally cartoonish character, so I would be someone who would be easy to do a study on. But as a researcher, I love being able to see the moment when I'm tracking them through an experience, and you just see that one movement that lets you know as a researcher, wait, let's go back to that. And you might very easily be able to see it if you're shoulder to shoulder with them in a usability lab, but being right across from them, and again, it scales up nicely too. If you're using DScout Recruiter, you're bringing your own people, you're accessing maybe hopefully a more diverse, broader population. And so you might see over several sessions that one spot during the app experience or the account setup or the shopping cart, whatever it is, they make that one face, or that you can see their eyebrows raise. It really gets you this minute detail that lets you make recommendations based on actual behavior. Casey, you work with the studio on like innovation projects, sometimes very high in the sky. We might call them Horizon 4 projects. Are there any use cases that you have found remote moderated work for?
Yeah, I think in particular, they're not so simple in terms of conversational interviews, right? And that was something where I initially was very reluctant as someone that had a lot of background and in-depth kind of experience in the field, how is that going to work for me? And really getting into some foundational concepts, like these big ideas, how am I going to establish rapport kind of using this tool? And so I think recently we've done a lot with card sorting and being able to kind of have them go through activities together that is easier to facilitate, frankly, remotely, and then kind of come back to the one-to-one, not talk to me about that. We're back to being face-to-face kind of in a very intimate way. And so I think that's something that we've had with a lot of success of kind of walking through some relatively simple activities, but being able, again, to kind of have this omni-channel or a variety of inputs with a kind of participant in a short amount of time has been very effective.
That's great. Tim, Tessa, anything else to comment on use cases? I'll look to the chat and see if there are any questions. Yeah, just a reiteration, you will have this fantastic dialogue in the slides as well. So if you do have to jump, we understand. All right, let's move then to some of it's not perfect for everything. And so we wanted to talk about some of the roadblocks, potholes, and friction points. So Tess, why don't you kick us off, since you are often thinking about some of the technical aspects of some of these roadblocks and how to support researchers. What are some of the things that you're seeing that folks should consider that might be a roadblock or a pothole when using these methods?
Definitely. I think, I mean, the first bullet point is on the head. I think often when you're doing a video call, and it's as easy as looking at it in your calendar, and it's like, this is an hour. And I don't know if other people have done field work, but normally those in-homes are like 3 hours. I've had a 5-hour in-home that just went way too long. But you know, you want to keep going. You want to keep going with the source of truth. But when you're on certain products or you're doing it digitally or remote, there's this weird aspect of like, okay, I have an hour and I need to fit in all of these things. So, you know, going remote has that kind of weird barrier and weird limitation. Even though you could do a Zoom for 3 hours, that's a lot to have someone sit there and just stare at a screen. It's a lot to ask from someone. I think, you know, given what people keep talking about, about that contextual inquiry that you get from doing field work, going in, seeing the person's environment, I think that even though you can do that using live mobile or using Zoom or Skype or FaceTime or whatever, you always have to remember that you're streaming a video. Sometimes you have to be like, okay, slow down. Let's let the video render so I can see what you're showing me. Or, oh, you're now showing me the corner of a table. You're actually not showing me anything relevant, but you have to say it in like a very nice way. I think also with screen shares, there's a lot of complexity. I mean, I know this with trying to, the team and I trying to harden the technology behind live, screen shares are funky. There's a reason why we're always like, can you see my screen? I mean, not, 99% of the time, yes, they can see your screen, but you still have to say that because there are those times where it doesn't work, or the prototype that you had some designer build is missing a click path. And then you're in this awkward position where you're like, well, hold on, just let me click through it manually. I think there's also that idea of the international logistics and tech bandwidth. I think, Casey brought it up before about inclusivity. I think when it comes to doing things remote, we can't just assume everybody has, 5G or whatever we're on now, connected to an Ethernet and has, the best Wi-Fi ever. I think what we found, especially with our customers, and Tim, I don't know if you've heard of any customers in this way, but when you're doing studies internationally where, in some of the international places that we've had where people are using different phones than what we have in America, they don't have access to the type of high-speed internet maybe that we do, that those calls, especially when they're overseas, can have some lagginess, can have some technical difficulties. That's where I think remote interviewing gets a little hairy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely, especially that sort of intersection of prolonged screen share, and then maybe a technologically complex user interface or a prototype that you're asking someone to work through, and international. Those sort of two can sort of come together to create some roadblocks or some sort of performance issues during the call. I think that definitely shows up probably more so on the mobile phone than on a computer, just because mobile phones aren't as powerful, don't have as much processing power as a computer. So definitely want to sort of test it as much as you can before the session actually happens to make sure that the sort of prototype and the interaction that you're looking to understand is you're actually able to sort of see it from start to finish.
Yeah, and I think to that point too, there's also kind of this broader sense of like one of the biggest pros is the efficiency and kind of how quick you can do all these things. But it's also, you can run into logistics of not figuring out like time zones of when you're interviewing, where you're not in person. So you have to make sure that you're going to actually be up, that your team members are going to be up, or that you're asking them, right, to not interview at 1 a.m. What kinds of colloquial phrases are you using around kind of the experience, the prototype? Are you assuming a certain vernacular? I think also within the US, but also particularly that's really maximized when we've been doing international work. Like it's so easy to kind of connect, but we also have to make sure we do the proper amount of kind of homework of what's going to really land and be a good experience for our participants.
And that's such a good call in, Casey, because I think when you're designing, building, making, testing something, you can often really forget the nomenclature and the idioms that you might be using to describe an experience path or how to do something. You're interested in what makes the most sense, but yes, making sure that you're checking your verbiage and your definitions is really important. 2 points here I want to make. One is a question from Jabri in the chat. Would you recommend focusing on one-on-one sessions rather than group sessions remotely? I'm wondering if this crew can talk about some of the benefits of, so DScout Live is a one-on-one tool. And I'm curious if you all can talk about the benefits that you all have seen by going one-on-one as opposed to trying to have multiple people in a room, or do you have experience with that? Talk a bit more about the one-to-one and the benefits there.
I think in terms of the one-to-one, like there's a gut that we all sense that someone's looking elsewhere when you're remote, that you're not quite as engaged. And so this is a way, I think, to Tim's earlier point, where you feel very centered. I talk with my hands a lot. They know I'm right there with them. We are I can attend to what they're saying, what they're doing. Also, we can be more flexible. So if their child busts in, that's okay. We can take a pause, or I can ask them, they want to step back, come back, and it's a certain amount of time later. If there are scheduling challenges, we can be more adaptive as things kind of change throughout the day. So I think there is kind of really the logistical piece, as well as more of that, like it's easier to build rapport and maintain that for a sustained period of time.
Yeah, it's a great point. Just like sort of piggybacking off of the conversation on like internet bandwidth and wanting to make sure that the tech setup is working properly for each person that you're talking with. If you are in a sort of like multi-person session or a group session and one person's tech bandwidth starts to sort of tweak out a little bit or get a little bit glitchy, which just happens sometimes, that can kind of impact the whole session and kind of bring down the I guess the session a bit. And so being able to go one-on-one, you have the ability to sort of troubleshoot one-on-one with someone without sort of souring the group session.
Yeah, and I would just add that even though, us four were making this as seamless as possible, plot twist, it's a little rehearsed. And I think when you're doing a group session with a bunch of scouts or participants, nobody knows when they're supposed to really talk, right? And let's be fair, even in a meeting when we're all on Zoom or whatever, we're all waiting to see that unmute button. We're all waiting to, like, is it my turn to talk? Okay, somebody else has said my point. I'm not going to say something. So from a researcher perspective, those issues that you may have with, co-creation lab or a focus group where you're trying to minimize groupthink, you're trying to make sure that it's inclusive, and even the people who don't want to be the loudest voice in the room is voicing their opinion. That just becomes, I think, more complex when you take it digitally, which I think why one-on-one works so well is you have that privacy, you have that candidness, and you're removing that weird choreographed dance between a bunch of people virtually.
That's a great point. And Tess, I'm sure you're seeing Etan's question about us and a few other potential other tools that folks might use. Etan, I'm hoping that we can answer that question through the third part of our presentation here. We're going to now dig into the doing of remote moderated research, and we're going to look at it through the lens of DScout. We can certainly leave time at the end to answer if Tess has any specific questions about what she thinks about the specific value props of live specifically, or DScout from Casey and Tim more broadly. But let's move to, if they're, make sure, nope, no other questions right now. Let's move to now the doing of, the practice of remote moderated research. And hopefully at the end of this section, we'll get you set up now that you know a bit more about the benefits broadly, some of the considerations that you should have going in. Let's get now into the brass tacks of doing it. So let's first talk with the setup. We've alluded to the consideration care, the inclusive, accessible considerations that you have. Casey, I'm hoping you can tell us a bit more about some of the things that you like to stress for folks. And on the right here, folks, this is our built-in scheduler for DScout Live. So I'll try to call out when you're looking at an image from the DScout platform specifically. But Casey, I'm hoping you can kick us off a bit about some of the best practices that you have here.
Yeah, so I think one of the most important is kind of your first interaction when you're figuring out who you selected and are inviting to participate. So we have kind of a set of research guidelines that are built around kind of best practices for inclusivity. And one of the key ones that we've had is, do you need any accommodations? Like asking that well before. So we've had in terms of kind of low vision users or folks that maybe have color blindness or other factors that might come into play, or just in terms of their schedule, their life, where they might be when they're having an interview. So asking for a variety of how accommodations that would make it more comfortable for them is a really important part of kind of setting that tone right up front. There's also kind of giving them a sense of what we're going to be doing during the session. So offering them kind of options for what else we're going to talk about, giving them a sense of the roadmap. So that's kind of all in terms of focusing on the participant. There's also, since as a researcher, pacing yourself. So you can see with the kind of GIF, there's all of the scheduling. It's easy to kind of want to jam pack everything in there. And that is, I think, where we really have a best practice we found, especially remote. As much as it can kind of be time saving, it's still draining. You're really focused, you're really in tune for that hour or however long the interview may be. So we always try to build in kind of a reflection time, a debriefing session directly after. And what I love about the scheduling tool is that we can kind of know upfront all the options we're giving folks with that in mind. So knowing that we're going to have to talk to our client after, wanting to kind of process our plan, what key analytical themes are already popping up, all that we want to build in time for. So we typically have, if you're having an hour-long interview, that you have an hour then before the next one would be scheduled. And personally, this is where it varies, but having more than like 3 to 4 interviews in a day is kind of where I tap out, because we just want to be able to be giving the same experience, the same level of care and attention as you would at the end of the day. That's very similar to in person, but I think you can kind of run into a trap remotely because it's so easy to schedule and coordinate everything.
Tim, how about you? What are some of the coaching or the suggestions that you give to customers when they're about to embark on their sessions?
Yeah, so just to reiterate Casey's point, just don't overdo it in one day. You might be able to do that one day with maybe 5 or 6 sessions, but you're probably going to feel it on day 2. Probably wish that you would have spread it out a bit more throughout the week. So that's a big one. And yeah, that's what I would say.
Tess, can you talk a bit more about what went into creating the scheduler and some of the other pre-session customizations that you and the team were thinking through?
Yeah, I think when we went out and asked researchers, what they do before entering the call, there's a lot of dance between their Google calendars, their email, messaging people, using Calendly, trying to communicate what's available, what's not. We wanted to make an all-in-one spot for that. So our tool is a hybrid between kind of Calendly of setting up time slots, allowing the scout to then choose themselves where they want to be scheduled. But there's a lot of automated messaging that goes into it. And if you're like me, who's terrible at email, that's a huge time saver. For when I reschedule someone, a rescheduling email gets sent out, and I can chat with them. And I think that was the goal, was to make it kind of like Calendly, but also make it the micro interactions on the calendar feel like Google Calendar when you use it. So it has a very familiar feel, and I think it just saves a lot of time and saves a lot of places where I have to look.
Yeah, and this is me earlier at a research project saying, "Sure, I'll do 100 interviews a day." And you can see in the GIF here, I've selected the breaks that I want, and I'm able to set time, both to Casey, Tim, and Tessa's point. One other thing that I've really enjoyed using as a live researcher is the tech check. We don't have a screen of it here, but Tessa and her team have gone through great lengths to ensure that the technology will work roughly as expected, because as we've said, internet is a damn hard thing to predict. But Tessa and her team have this really great, intuitive, experienced set of modals wherein you check a microphone, a camera, the participant, the scout, has to make sure that their bandwidth is good, and there are a bunch of color and iconography to let them know you're good to go. And that, of course, lets you as a researcher know, okay, the scout has had some coaching themselves before, not just, so you don't have to just be thinking about your observers or collaborators or your STIM and making sure the prototype is ready. DScout automatically asks the scouts to go through this tech check is what I call it. And so that when you arrive at the session, you know that they've had some coaching on what to expect technologically, which always makes things for me go smoother. So thank you, +1 to Tess, for that great work. And we have been talking a lot about observers and collaborators, and this is just one of those. Don't underestimate how awesome it can be. I mean, those of you who have ever had a customer or a stakeholder or a collaborator join you for an infield, at the end of it, they're just gushing about the method. But again, to the point here, like they might only come to one session. They're not doing the weeks-long study and then the analysis and the synthesis. Using remote methods and tools like DScout Live allows you to invite people in, and then they can participate in the process, but do so in a way that doesn't distract the participant. It might distract you depending on your expectation setting. So Casey, you have had a lot of experience with clients who are interested in the method, want to get involved. What are some of the things that you talk about with them?
Yeah, we have the benefit of having very engaged and smart clients, but they are also, that is something that it's making sure well in advance again of the interview, that who's going to be actually fielding questions, how are we going to incorporate those, at what points do you want to make sure that I can build in maybe a pause. I'm letting the participant know in advance, hey, there are folks that are watching. It's not like we have some kind of, hidden mirror, but that they're not going to hear them. I am talking to you. I will ask them once in a while, is there anything else you want me to offer or kind of surface to them? And so I think that's been a really useful tool. It's not that distracting. I was a little worried about it my first couple go arounds, but setting up in advance of like, I can pause, but I also am having a conversation. So we need to I will kind of do it in batches of looking back through what's being fielded. And also if there's a lot of observers that are joining, identifying who's kind of the spokesperson in terms of being able to field then questions from a very limited number of folks has really worked well in terms of our experience.
And Casey, do you let the participant know that there are observers on the call? I know I have moderated focus groups where, like you said, that they haven't had to ask. There is a two-way mirror. They kind of get what that is. But when it's more invisible, as DScout Live is, you can invite folks, but the scout is not told or shown in the interface. How do you manage that with them?
Yeah, that's always part of the expectation setting in the beginning of the interview. So I always let them know, we go through what's going on the platform, how are we understanding who might be joining me or not. And I always highlight they're really interested in what you have to say. So they're closely listening. I will field them, but you're only having me that you're talking to. And so I think that's something that typically they find it kind of interesting. It's like there's a bit of mystery of who is part of this call. But overall, it kind of fields away quickly. So they're just really focusing on our interaction. And at the end of a call, I always ask, is there anything else that you want me to kind of circle back to my observers to make sure they feel like we've covered the ground that they were looking for?
And that's great. I think then that's my bullet point here, 1-to-1 as opposed to 1-to-many. You may have many folks on the call, but having the participant focus, informing them of what's going on, being transparent, but letting them know that it'll just be you and them speaking. I'm going to tease ways that you can get your collaborators involved with the analysis process. Casey and the studio team have had a lot of success asking their observers, stakeholders, clients to actually engage and sort of put up a pin in parts of the sessions that they think are particularly useful and interesting, which of course, if you know what your collaborators and stakeholders found interesting, that might help you narrow in and focus in on and start your analysis on the right or left, depending on your modality foot. Tim, this was something that you surfaced when we were having our conversation. You can screen share with DScout Live. You can have participants be shown various STEM boards of either video, audio, or maybe visiting a prototype. What are some things that folks need to keep in mind, though, if they're going to have scouts not just talk with you, but interact with something? Yeah,
for sure. So one of the things to keep in mind is that you can sort of serve up multiple stimuli boards within DScout. You definitely want to name your stimuli boards, right? So if you have multiple stimuli boards, you have one concept in one, another concept in another, maybe a link in another one. When it's go time and you're actually doing the session with someone, what you don't want to do is be questioning, wait, which piece of STEM is in which one of these stimuli boards? So definitely name your stimuli boards. And I just always encourage customers to just test beforehand, just to make sure that everything is showing up the way that they want it to, that the experience is exactly how they want it once the sessions go live.
Tessa, your thoughts on this? I'm curious, as again, the person who has both used your experience as a researcher and then been building this, thoughts on when folks want to either share STEM or screen share themselves, thoughts that you think they should keep in mind?
Yeah, I think a couple of different things. When it's screen sharing and you want the external participant, I know we've talked about it before about like privacy and stuff. I mean, we have on our walkthrough a little like tip that says, hey, if you may be asked to share your screen. So if there's anything sensitive or private, exit out of that. And I think that's really important to think about and maybe touch again on your end if you remembered, oh my gosh, I know I want to have them share their screen, but I didn't tell them that when I invited them. So I think that's something up front. And I would also say testing your stimuli, let's say it's a URL, is something that's important, not only to make sure, okay, the technology works, I'm familiar, I know how to use it, but sometimes, when you're going through and you're testing the prototype that your designer put together or that you put together, you may find, oh, this is really long, or maybe this is where we should break it up. And I think that's something that is often missed, that you can pilot and test beforehand for your benefit of how you want the flow to go.
Casey, your thoughts, and anything else to add to the piloting of activities? You had mentioned doing card sorts with folks, asking them to, I think you had mentioned mural boards or mural walls where you're asking them to kind of show and walk through things. Other thoughts that you think?
Yeah, we found that when you're introducing another form of technology that they may or may not have experience with, that it's sometimes helpful to be the one that's driving. So I say, like, you tell me where to go. And that kind of also puts them in the position of a bit of like the power seat, where I'm like their tech support, moving a cursor around, moving around kind of different sticky notes and things like that. So it also makes it interactive, but it is something that can be helpful to have control rather than trying to troubleshoot for them remotely. That can be tricky. So we definitely approve we've done it both ways, but I think sharing your screen can be useful kind of flip as well.
Mm-hmm. And the automatic transcription makes it such that your hands can be busy doing the driving, and you don't have to worry about or be concerned about missing, something. And there's something about that co-embodiment of driving an experience as a participant. My communication nerdiness is getting away with me, but yeah, I think that's great. That's a really great thought. Okay, let's move to in session. We have mentioned before the importance of establishing rapport. I have seen in a lot of discussion forums about using remote research, this folks wondering about and concerned about kind of stiffness or staleness or just general fatigue. Lots of folks, their day in and day out work, either school or work, involves this very much. So if you're asking them to participate in a session and you're able to incentivize them, that might get them engaged. But what are some of the ways that each of you has found to keep folks interested in the tasks and the activities at hand?
I think one of the key pieces is to remember that it is the same as in person in that way. Like, you don't want to forget all your good practices of building rapport, having communication, asking if you're pronouncing their name correctly, what pronouns they prefer, that you've really done your homework. on who they are. We often do interviews as a follow-up to diary. So that's kind of indicating I already know what you've said, reiterating back to them what they've communicated, having a general kind of sense of like, where is the lay of the land in the platform? I might be using an outside tool later on, but I'm not expecting you to, you know, manage that. I'll be handling it. So it's a lot of that kind of upfront expectations that are set, but also kind of keeping the same good practices you do in person.
Mm-hmm. One thing I would add to that is that because you're not there in person, some of the nonverbal cues that you can provide to let the participant know that you're listening, like leaning forward, things like that, they're not as available. They're sort of harder to communicate, and so I think that sort of gets back to the importance of not looking off the screen, sort of letting the participant or the scout know that you are engaged, you are interested, you know, through nodding, making sure that you're sort of giving those sort of micro validations to let the scout know that you're there and present.
Yeah, and just to add to Casey's point of, you know, building in small talk, not forgetting your best practices about building rapport. I think those of us who come from like a grounded theory, especially when you're doing in-homes or field work, where there's a physical environment to explore, right? And your discussion guide isn't as front and center. And that guide is really more of a guide. I think it's easy when you're going remote and using something digital to have that guide front and center and almost feel like it's a checklist rather than forget your practice of this is just a suggested guide. These are the relative places I want to hit, but I need to make room to build rapport, to explore, to go down, you know, a thread of inquiry that I may not think about, and create time for that. I think is something that's hard to remember when you're doing remote interviews. I know I forget, and I use my discussion guide as a checklist, which is easy to do, but something that is very valuable to remember.
That's awesome. Yeah. Thank you all. That's very, very helpful. I'm actually going to skip our next slide to respect both your time and the time of our guests. So folks, we're going to turn now to the platform and show you some suggestions, or rather walk through some of the ways that these folks think about analysis and synthesis in DScout specifically. You know, you want to maximize your session, and part of that is making crib notes, making sure that you're kind of focusing yourself both on the session, but setting yourself up for success and smoothness in a post session. And Tess and her team have gone through great lengths to be thinking about that. So this is the project that we will add you to after the session here. It's called Brew or Buy, where we, as we often do, looked at coffee habits, whether folks were in their home making coffee or out in the world. And we did, you can see here, we did a diary mission to ask folks about those out in the world moments versus the in their home moments. We used a DScout recruit screener to find a diverse sample of folks. So to the question from Etienne earlier, one of the benefits I think of DScout is that it's vertically integrated. So you can recruit with us. You can do some pre-session homework. So we're talking about that rapport building. A great way to do that is to ask them some questions about themselves in a mobile moments mission. You can say, you know, show me some artifacts in your house that really are valuable to you when you're talking about maybe a smart speaker study that's on the higher end and you want that smart speaker to feel like a valuable item. Ask them to show you 3 things that they value and why. And so then, to Casey's point, you go into that session knowing those valuable things, understanding both their pronouns and how to correctly pronounce their name, but you know, you have a bit of background and context about their situation, scenario, and what's going on in their world. So that to me is one of the primary benefits, Etienne, over for DScout over others, is that we have all these other tools that play nicely together and that really let you harness the most out of a single study. It's multi-method and they all really work well together. So in this particular project, we're going to look at the live mission because that's the moderated part. And we're going to look at Sarah H. And you can see here in this view, we have some iconography that essentially just means screen sharing, a favorited clip, markers, and all of these things go into making the most of a session. So I'm going to blow this up. And Casey, why don't you walk through some of the things that you do to make the most of a session on DScout Live?
Yeah, I think there's kind of one piece that we've noticed, like it's really impressive to me the first time I saw it, was our observers are able to mark. So they can drop that pin rather than just asking you a million questions. They can kind of also go in and feel that they're owning some of the data. So like highlighting some of the markers that could be dropped. Might be good to go over the video. Yeah. So you can see on the top line, those are the indications of where you want to come back to. It's like a pin drop. I think about it as breadcrumbs for later. And the fact that you can label them so you know why or what you were thinking about. For me, in the moment, I'll do that during an interview, just a keyword or something that I knew I can find and is easily searchable. So that's something that's a really useful tool for as a moderator, but also for the rest of your team. Another key feature is the notes. So if you want to, that's something that I don't take a lot of notes while I'm actually moderating. But if you look at the icon all the way to the right, the little notepad, this is something where you can see if folks have dropped in notes. So I can see, again, my observers' comments, my other team members can give me cues as to like where they were at. These are time-stamped. That blew my mind the first time I used it. And really thinking about kind of where, again, how can you coordinate with markers and notes? Where do you want to begin your beginning to kind of pull together your analysis? Another key feature that's not less textual based on is kind of creating clips. So we often kind of use clips as another kind of bookmark. So you can go in, plop, and say, like, I want to come back to this really, this is where they really nailed it or had a very interesting insight. And you can also have a sense then of kind of throughout how long. They can be very quick or more prolonged. You can highlight and copy text, which is great for pulling into an Excel sheet if you want to have it somewhere else. So kind of being able to use this as a really wholesale platform that does also help you kind of in other tools you're used to. Another key feature I want to highlight, though, is the kind of creating a playlist. So you can create these clips. I kind of use them willy-nilly. It's like, oh, anything that's interesting. And then going back into favorite using the heart to be able to know how do I want to pull a playlist later on to show a client, or making sure that they see the clients can also create, clips. So this is kind of where, again, seeing what's kind of popping, what are we capturing the best.
That to me, using this to echo what Casey had said. So I know I just went through a lot here, but you can see that the transcript is interactive. So you can start with it. If there are particular parts in the transcript that you cue in on, whether it's a competitor that was mentioned or a particular adjective that you want to cue in on, you can highlight that. You can copy it and drop it right into a deliverable. You can create a clip right from the transcript. You can make a mark. Markers are great in session, but you can also drop markers after session. So again, DScout is all about trying to make research less precious. It's long. It has long tails. We collect a shitload of stuff, if I can be so bold. It's screen shares, it's facial expressions, it's transcriptions, it's notes. And so this is made for you to really continue to dig and go back to it. Tess, other things that you were thinking about and that you find valuable in the analysis here. I'll pull up the clip creator here in a second, but please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, this view, so I'm like Casey, I go clip crazy, especially as a PM now where I can't be in all of these sessions. And so what's helpful is my coworker, Taylor, who's our researcher, I'll go in and I don't even need to spend an hour watching each session because I have that transcript. I can use her markers or other people's markers to navigate to it, grab those clips or favorite clips that I find important. Either create a playlist, thankfully I don't have stakeholders that breathe down my neck and say, show me where they said that as much. But the being able to favorite or toggling off which clips are mine, I think really helps. And I think, Ben, something that you and I have talked about a lot is the superpower of the search. On some of those other pages that we have where it's more like a file folder with the overview page, or if you go into the clips and playlist view, that I think is something that you just can't really get anywhere else. So when we talk about competitive differentiators, this little thing is a gem. Farmers is a great one. It will actually preview what that transcript is. I can navigate to the clip. If I'm lazy and I already know that's the clip, I can add it to a playlist. You go into the overview session, Ben, and search farmers. We wanted to make sure that there was some sort of preview so you could see all of those moments and go into it. I mean, I don't know if other people have had experiences with this, but when you have clips in a folder from QuickTime and you have your notes and you have transcripts that you've gotten from some program, having to find something even if you found it in one place, now you need to find it in all the other places is a headache. And we really tried to make it so if you find it once, you can grab everything you need.
And importantly, on top of everything that Tess and Casey just showed you, if you do have a previous method that you like, you're a rainbow tagger, or you want to drop it in Airtable, you can take everything out of DScout. We don't hold any of it hostage. So Tess and her team have thought really, really hard on whose camera can you export. Well, we're going to give you the option to do both or neither. You can do the full session. You can do just the one part where someone is sharing their screen. So again, you don't have to offload it all and hope, oh shit, I hope this works. You can keep coming back to it. DScout can be your repository where you're making tags, making notes, inviting collaborators, and then you can piecemeal pull things out and drop it into your decks. We haven't even shown, after you render or make a playlist, you can share it in a Slack channel, or you can share a public link that you can set a password so that if it does have sensitive IP information in it, you can keep that sensitive. So again, we're researchers. We're first and foremost people nerd researchers who wanted to use a tool that would help us extend our work and make it easier. And so that's, I hope one of the primary things that you take from this is that this isn't a tool just to fill a tool vacuum. There is a vacuum, I think, for effective, smooth, and easy to use tools. And we as researchers are building it this way. Other comments, other thoughts, folks? I know I've gone all over. And again, for those of you still watching, thanks for sticking with us. You will get access to this project, so you can poke through, you can try the search, you can try the export, anything that you think that you want to try out, it's here for you. But again, for me, the clips and playlists, for those of you who ever had, you're staring down a multi-hour session, man, being able to mark things during your session. Oh, they said our competitor. And every time they say the competitor, or every time they say, just that buzzword, that keyword, or that part of the experience, you can go back, kind of expand it. And I hope you've seen that when you're in a playlist, you can trim by the transcript, which, man, you've got that one quote you want to lead with your deliverable. It's so easy to just quickly go right to it. And this is because I've already rendered a playlist and we're re-editing. It's all fine. But you can also do it here in the playhead. Flexibility is, I think, the name of the game. So I'll turn it to our panelists to see if there's anything that they want to conclude with, any final thoughts. And then after that, we will bid adieu. Folks, anything else?
I think maybe one last thing I want to say is or just reinforce is how Live is designed to play nice with other parts of the DScout platform. So say we did one of those in-home usage tests where someone's showing you the setup of a new speaker. You capture the sort of initial impressions, the initial setup process. If you wanted to, you could invite the scouts to a follow-up longitudinal diary mission right within the platform, invite the scout from the live session directly into diary in a seamless process. And it sort of allows you to get both methodologies in one spot.
And I think from my vantage point, it's really having kind of, to Tim's point of like having it all in one spot, particularly using Live. I've never used anything else as an interviewer and a moderator, that I was so happy with the on-platform experience that I really did kind of want to hold off until I wanted to export, because I had so many tools and being able to have a good sense. And it was very easy. It took me 5 minutes to learn how to use kind of the clips and playlist. And I am not necessarily the most tech savvy. So this was something that was really like pretty high threshold. But even kind of the transcript, also the accuracy of the transcript.
Yes, it's editable. So if, for me, Tess, something I don't think I've told you, you won't be shocked to hear. We have a breakdown at the top of the percentages of folks who chat. This as a moderator for me was so illuminating that I need to just shut up. I was always in like the upper 70s and I was like, my God, when is the participant doing any talking? So for me as a communicator, it was a really great reminder that I am not the user. I am not the customer. I am not the star of the show tier. But you can edit the transcript. You can search the transcript. You can make it auto scroll. So if there's a part in the transcript that you know, or the video that you know by eye that you want to start at, you can see that the transcript goes to it. Or again, you can click into the transcript and the video will follow. Tess, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that's why we built that percentage speaker.
For Ben, that was the Ben feature.
Behind me yapping. Yes. How do I?
Tess, I have a question. Tess, I have another question. Tess, I have an idea. Yeah.
No, I actually think I probably rant more, but I would just say to the people who are on, just have fun exploring. I think in everything that we've talked about today, there's a lot of things to consider. And then at the end of the study, you have so much data. And so I'd love to see more people play with our tool, because we try to make it as playful as possible rather than be really rigid. So, you know, just even hearing Casey, you talk about the different ways that you use it, I'm like, oh, wow, I didn't even think about that. I should start doing it.
And if you have comments, questions, feedback, you can holler at me. I'm Ben at DScout. And if there is a specific question that you'd like to route to any of these folks, I'm going to go ahead and volunteer their time. I will pass that message along. Certainly, Tess is a product leader here at DScout, and then in the space more broadly, would love to hear your feedback using other tools, things you like and you think DScout might be able to use. But Nancy, great. Let's see here. Cool. Glad you think it looks well, and Jai as well. Yes, I think intentional design is to something that both our product team broadly and Tessa and her team specifically would absolutely say is an ethos part of their of what they're doing. So thank you again for joining us. We will have a follow-up, both the recording the deck and this project, so that you can poke around. We encourage you strongly to start thinking about remote methods. It's good for a whole host of reasons, and we hope you'll choose DScout to do so, because we really care about this stuff. So thank you to Tess, Casey, and Tim. It was so nice to share a little bit of digital space with you all. I can't wait to see the breakout for how much I talked relative to all of you. Hopefully it's below 50%. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving, y'all. Stay safe, stay well, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.